Kusuzang Pola, Professor Nanwani, the moderator, fellow panelists, student resident coordinator Carla Hershey, Dr. Sharma, Mr. Prasai. The presentation and the topic today is bridging the social and economic divide. And I think it's a good balance because we have a lot of the social, and I think Mr. Prasai and I will talk about the economic divide. I want to actually start with congratulating the Jigme Singh Wangchuk School of Law on the inaugural Paro Forum and the launching of the Climate Change and Environmental Law Center. I think this is really, it's really going to be a center of excellence and competence on this issue for the region. I want to express my heartfelt appreciation to Her Royal Highness Princess Sonam Dechen Wangchuk for the honor of joining the forum, and to congratulate the founding dean, Sangedoji, and also the many law students. I heard the first batch of law students have actually joined the judiciary, so a very big congratulations. Over the last 2 days, you've heard about the impact of climate change. And you've heard about, I mean, in our region in South Asia, we've had the unprecedented monsoon floods. And you have to remember this is happening with a 1.1 degree centigrade. So we've looked at, and a focus a lot of this, the last 2 days has been adaptation. So we now know that most countries have national adaptation planning instruments, and we know 84% of parties to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change have actually started to look at adaptation plans, strategies, laws, and policies. I want to spend a few minutes in terms of emissions. UNEP, every year we produce an emission gap report, and we are looking at a global warming of 2.4 to 2.6 degrees. And we're also looking at, if you start to look at the region, and you start to look at what it means to try to stay within a 1.5 degree world, we have to reduce emissions globally by 7.6%. Our trajectory is up. 80% of global emissions come from 20 G20 countries. So you've heard that yesterday. 58% of greenhouse gas emissions in the Asia-Pacific region come from 7 G20 countries, and 43% come from 3 G20 countries. So we know we need large-scale, rapid transformation, and we know it's phasing out coal-fired power plants. We're looking at the energy transition. And so you think, what can Bhutan do? We sequester greenhouse gases. You've heard we sequester 3 times the emission from the large forest sinks. So when the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change started, it started with the principle of common but differentiated responsibility. And so the idea was there were historical emissions, there would be climate finance, and there would be technology transfer for the gap. So you've heard, I mean, Carla talked about within the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, $100 billion globally. But if you start to look at the funds that, you know, and I will spend a few minutes on numbers. Between 2019 and 2020, 34 billion increase, a lot of it was on buildings. Sustainable transport was 28 billion, adaptation finance 20 billion. We've seen an increase in adaptation finance, and there's been a call for it. We've seen public climate finance grow. We've seen what we call the developed countries. There's been a 6% growth to a growth of about 40.1 billion on average. When you talk about 100 billion, you're really talking about a very small subset of public funds. And so you're looking at, there has been, and if you look at the 100 billion, the financial mechanism of the UNFCCC Secretariat is the Green Climate Fund and the Global Environment Facility. We have the Adaptation Fund, which is part of the Kyoto mechanism, and the Special Climate Change Fund. We had a voluntary fund, the Least Developed Countries Fund, and we were able to mobilize 1.5 billion. And when I look at numbers that Bhutan accessed, I mean, it was the 1.59 billion was for national adaptation programs of action and to implement adaptation activities. And Bhutan actually was able to access it was 40.19 million. And if you start to look at the lowering of the Thothome Lake, that came from the LDC fund. You've also heard yesterday from the Green Climate Fund, the day before, from Madam Oyun, who said Bhutan accessed over 50 million from the Green Climate Fund. And we know that GEF 8, which has about 852 million allocated to climate mitigation, Bhutan will have overall an allocation of 10 million. So if you look at our size, I mean, we're not doing too badly. You've seen the multilateral development banks also increase funding 46 billion, 45 billion for developing and emerging economies. What I'm seeing, so you have numbers, but what you're seeing is, and you've heard that LDC's access from the 10 billion of the Green Climate Fund, we accessed 15% of the fund. And so we went back to what were challenges faced by LDCs. The vulnerabilities of LDCs are well recognized. And I think the climate narrative is clear, but the additionality justification remains a major challenge. And what you've had in adaptation finances, for mitigation, it's been quite easy. You reduce emissions of greenhouse gases. And so I think what Dr. Sharma talked about, the whole nature-based solutions, and we actually have a definition of nature-based solutions, and the link Carla was talking about biodiversity between nature and climate is really important. What we found LDCs, and I think, I mean, you know, in Bhutan, and I have in front of me, you know, Dasha Senchinobu, who was National Environment Commission Secretary. We have incoming Director General of the new department, Ms. Tashi Pem, who will now lead this work and take it forward. And we have Jigme, my colleague, who works in the UNFCCC Secretariat, and he works on transparency. So we have actually a lot of colleagues in Bhutan who've really been successful in taking forward the narrative and actually raising funds. But we found that LDCs don't have project-specific climate narrative. We have inadequate specific data and information. You know, you need downscaled data, climate scenarios, the modeling. We don't have the data. We found data and information to justify additionality and to do analysis, whether it's social, environmental safeguards, the analysis. LDCs have had difficulty in putting this forward. They've also had difficulty in harmonizing data and information requirements for additional justification. And they found it difficult to expedite access to climate finance. And so if you look at a GCF proposal often, and if you look at the larger ones, and Madam Oyun was saying that Mongolia, they leveraged 500 million, you start to look at the time frame. It takes between 1 to 4 years. And I think you have to look at the kind of investments LDCs have. We've seen there are also major human technical capacity constraints for the project cycle, starting from design to implementation. Mobilizing technical, managerial, expert design, expertise for design implementation from both national and international sources. We found that LDCs and small island developing states have had difficulty. But before I hand over to, you know, Mr. Prasai, who's going to talk about private finance, today is really an exciting time, I think, for finance. I mean, the first thing is the kind of funds we're talking about, public finance, it's not going to give us a transformation. And you start to look at, and one of the reasons why adaptation finance is difficult, and I've started to do budget tagging work. In Indonesia, we do, you know, climate tagging. I've done that in Nepal. In Bhutan, we did a public environment expenditure review. All the public environmental expenditure reviews, it's clear, it's going to come from the country. I mean, you heard the case in Pakistan. You don't have shelter. You're not waiting for the Green Climate Fund to put your roof. You know, you have stagnant water, you need livelihoods. So it is going to come from national budgets. I mean, that is something. We're going to have to, you know, construct roads. The adaptation will mean that investments are deeper. You look at irrigation, you look at buildings, you look at floodplains. But today is an exciting time because actually, and I know that Madam Oyun talked about Mark Carney, there's a lot of work related to climate-related risk disclosures. I mean, banks now have to disclose. There's a lot of work in terms of the finance sector, in terms of financial flows. there's a lot of thinking, and I know when they're looking at the new World Bank president, the current president is stepping down, the idea is how do they put the money in climate change. All these issues with the IMF, and maybe Mr. Prasad can talk about special drawing rights. What does it mean? Because the institutions that we had post-World War II are no longer fit for purpose. And so it's really an exciting time. But I will stop with saying public sector cannot finance transformation. 100 billion sounds like a lot of money. We need to mobilize 3 to 6 trillion each year to transition to net zero emissions. We're going to need climate resilient economies by 2050. We have to have private finance to align these efforts. We have to have public and private sector work together to create an enabling environment. We're going to need policymakers, we're going to need development banks, we're going to need real economy, you're going to need financial institutions. Climate change is not good to have and nice to have. I mean, we're talking about, we're crossing planetary boundaries. We're looking at a 1.1 degree increase. You heard, we're going to have a third less water from the glaciers. In Pakistan, it was monsoon floods. And when we started to look at, and in the past, you always look at past trends. 100 years, what happened? We can't. We have to look at future scenarios. We're really looking, and as young law students here, I'm really excited that you're going to be thinking about climate change, because Bhutan is going to need you to be forward thinking. But with this, I hand over to Mr. Prasad, but back to the moderator. Thank you.